Welcome to the InnoGuide podcast. I'm your host, Bob Boudelier. This podcast, my website, and my weekly newsletter all focus on bringing you the secrets of innovation. Since I don't rely on paid ads, I want to thank our customers who subscribe to our AI Fusion Kickstarter program and those who leverage AI Fusion coaching to bring human-centered AI into their organizations. You can find us at www.innoguide.net. In this episode, number 68, we're sharing Part 2 of Supremacy by Parmy Olson. This was a long book, but a great book about the history of Google and the history of DeepMind. And if you listen to Part 1, I think you're going to enjoy Part 2. We had to break it into 3 parts because it was so long. So this is Part 2, and without further ado, please enjoy this episode. Welcome to the InnoGuide podcast, where we share the works of authors and mentors to guide innovation. Let's get started. Act 2, Chapter 7, Playing Games. A few blocks from London's King Cross Station, where tourists snap photos at platform 9 3/4, dreaming of Hogwarts, another kind of magic was unfolding. Inside a glass and steel Google's office, DeepMind's researchers were quietly chasing a dream that seemed just as fantastical: building an artificial general intelligence. By 2017, DeepMind had been part of Google for over 2 years. The perks were as plush as you'd imagine. Nap pods, massages, gyms, but for founders Demis Hassabis, Mustafa Suleyman, and Shane Legg, Google's money came with golden handcuffs. They had long dreamed of independence, and Google's latest offer dangled that possibility again. DeepMind could become a semi-autonomous alphabet company with its own profit and loss statements. Mustafa, always the pragmatic one, threw himself into proving DeepMind could be a viable business. His applied division tried to make reinforcement learning useful in the real world, optimizing energy systems, healthcare, robotics, while another team, DeepMind for Google, helped fine-tune YouTube recommendations and ad targeting. Google even promised them 50% of the value their work generated. This arrangement was productive but uneasy. Suleyman worried about AI's social fallout, job losses, inequality, unrest. People will be walking up to King's Cross with pitchforks if we don't think about equality, he'd warned. Hassabis, meanwhile, obsessed over containment, how to control a machine smarter than its maker. His solution? Recruit the world's sharpest minds, perhaps even the legendary mathematician Terence Tao, to mathematically lock in safety once AGI was near. He imagined assembling a kind of Avengers math to safeguard humanity. Mustafa disagreed. He believed that people, not equations, would ultimately govern AI safely. But their philosophical debates soon collided with corporate reality. Google scrapped the alphabet company idea again. The founders' déjà vu was painful. But then came a new glimmer of hope. Google offered a partial spin-out and a written term sheet promising $15 billion in funding over 10 years to help DeepMind operate independently. It sounded like freedom at last. Term sheet reportedly signed by Sundar Pichai himself convinced the founders this time was different. They even began planning the structure of a new entity, the Global Interest Company, GIC, a hybrid between a UN agency and a scientific trust. DeepMind would still license its breakthroughs to Google, but devote most of its work to humanity's problems, disease, climate, and knowledge itself. They dreamed big, even courting Barack Obama, a former U.S. vice president, and a CIA director to sit on its independent ethics board. But while DeepMind was planning its utopian rebrand, Google was chasing a more earthly mission, China. By now, China's tech market was exploding. With 650 million internet users and a GDP second only to the U.S., it was irresistible. Yet Google had been banned there since 2010 after refusing to censor search results and accusing Beijing of hacking activist Gmail accounts. In the years since, Chinese tech giants like Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu had thrived, often led by engineers trained in Silicon Valley. When Eric Schmidt and Sundar Pichai took the reins, they believed Google could charm its way back, and DeepMind's latest creation, AlphaGo, offered a perfect diplomatic weapon. Go wasn't just a game, it was an ancient Chinese art form, infinitely more complex than chess. Its possible board positions numbered 10 to the 170th power, dwarfing the atoms in the universe. When Larry Page mentioned his love for Go, Hassabis saw the opportunity immediately. If DeepMind's AI could defeat a world champion, it would do for AI what Deep Blue did for IBM. In 2016, AlphaGo faced South Korea's Lee Sedol, one of the world's best players. 200 million people tuned in. Midway through Game 2, AlphaGo made its now famous Move 37, an inexplicable placement on the fifth line of the board, far from the standard human strategy. Commentators gasped. Lee left the room. One thought the operator had clicked the wrong square. But 100 moves later, AlphaGo's stones converged in a perfect, almost poetic formation. It was a move no human would have made, yet it was right. Lee Sedol resigned. Hassabis described the move as beautiful. For the first time, an AI seemed to show creativity. The victory was electric. A Netflix documentary in Derry immortalized the moment, and DeepMind basked in global fame. But Google saw something more, a chance to use AlphaGo as a soft power, a kind of ping-pong diplomacy for the AI age. If AlphaGo could play and win in China, perhaps Google could too. So they arranged a match against Ke Ji, China's 19-year-old Go prodigy and world champion. Hassabis worried it was lose-lose. If they won, they'd look like arrogant Westerners beating China's best. If they lost, their legacy would be tarnished. But Pichai insisted. Hassabis negotiated a compromise. They'd debut AlphaGo Master, a leaner version running on a single Google chip, branding it as a research demo, not a rematch. In May 2017, the event took place in Wuzhen, China. Despite months of lobbying, Chinese state media blocked the broadcast. Hardly anyone in China saw it, yet AlphaGo Master swept all three games. On stage, Schmidt pivoted quickly, praising Google's TensorFlow software and pitching it to Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent, who politely didn't need it. Behind the scenes, Google was already working on Project Dragonfly, a censored search engine that tied users' searches to their phone numbers, essentially building surveillance for Beijing. The hypocrisy was staggering. Meanwhile, China announced its own AI moonshot plan to surpass the U.S. and lead the world in AI by 2030. The message was clear. China didn't need Google anymore. For DeepMind, AlphaGo's triumph had backfired. It made them indispensable to Alphabet, too valuable to ever be set free. Yet Hassabis pushed forward with the GIC spin-out, unveiling the plan at a staff retreat in rural Scotland. To the 300-plus researchers, it sounded thrilling. DeepMind would become the UN of AI, a global public interest lab with Google as a mere stakeholder. Staff nicknamed the plan Watermelon and whispered about it on encrypted signal chats. But as months passed, this plan stalled. The spin-out was always 6 months away. Rules about ethical boundaries, like banning military use, remained vague. Could they really sue Google if it crossed the line? No one knew. And Google was already blurring the lines. In 2017, it quietly joined the Pentagon's Project Maven, supplying AI for drone targeting, worth $250 million a year. When the deal leaked, employee outrage forced Google to withdraw, vindicating DeepMind's fears. Even so, DeepMind's own ethics work was painfully underpowered. Out of 1,000 staff, only a handful worked on ethics, and just 2 PhD-level researchers studied it full-time. The lab that claimed to benefit humanity had more baristas than ethicists. To outsiders, DeepMind's moral stance began to look more like branding than belief. They talked endlessly about fairness, transparency, and safety, but in practice, their focus was performance, prestige, and power. Their founders wanted to build the most advanced intelligence on Earth while still claiming to be its guardians. The deeper question hung in the air like smog over the King's Cross. Could you really build ethical AI inside a trillion-dollar corporation? The answer, as the next chapter would show, from inside Google itself, was a resounding no. Chapter 8. Everything is awesome. To understand why building ethical AI inside Google felt impossible, you first have to understand the scale of the beast. Alphabet, the parent company of Google, was worth roughly $1.8 trillion at the time of writing. Microsoft around $3 trillion, Apple hit $2 trillion. Amazon hovered near $1.7 trillion. These are numbers so large they stop feeling real. Oil giant ExxonMobil, once the world's symbol of corporate might, looks small at $450 billion. Walmart, America's retail empire, is about the same. In other words, a handful of Silicon Valley firms are now richer and more powerful than nearly every nation on Earth. And it's not just money, it's reach. Google controls 92% of global search. Facebook has over 2 billion users, and Apple has 1.5 billion iPhones in circulation. No empire, Roman, British, or American, has ever touched so many lives daily. They got there through acquisitions and data, an endless vacuum of personal information. Google knows what we search. Amazon tracks what we buy. Facebook watches what we click, like, and hate. The result is hyper-targeted advertising, recommendation algorithms, and infinite scroll, software designed not to serve you, but to keep you staring. Americans now check their phone an average of 144 times a day. But that engagement has a dark side. Algorithms amplify outrage because outrage keeps us scrolling. In 2016, Facebook's feeds supercharged political polarization in the U.S. They played a role in Brexit by promoting anti-immigration content. And in Myanmar, Facebook's algorithms helped fuel real-world violence, spreading hate speech against the Rohingya Muslims that Amnesty International later tied to genocide. Facebook admitted it hadn't done enough to stop it. Still, the company's business model thrived. Every tap, like, and comment made shareholders richer, and as one insider quipped, "We are not the consumers, we are the product." The tech giant's growth also came from the flywheel of network effects. The more users they had, the better their systems became, making it nearly impossible for competitors to catch up. Everyone joined Facebook because everyone else was on Facebook. Everyone buys iPhones because everything works better with other Apple products. Once you're in the ecosystem, you're kind of stuck. That level of dominance creates a chilling power of imbalance. A few CEOs, each worth billions, now control the privacy, identity, and future job prospects of billions of people. And yet, even inside these empires, a few voices tried to fight back. One of them was Timnit Gebru. When Gebru attended the 2019 NeurIPS conference, the same one where Musk and Altman announced OpenAI, she looked around the hall of thousands and felt a jolt. She was one of the only black women there. Born in Ethiopia, she'd fled the country as a teenager after her father died and civil war broke out. In the U.S., teachers discouraged her from taking advanced courses. She ignored them and earned her way to Stanford and later discovered the world of AI. But what she saw disturbed her. Algorithms were being given authority over critical decisions, credit scores, parole judgments, even police surveillance. Yet the systems were built mostly by white men using biased data. The result, technology that quietly reinforced racism. She studied Compass, a tool used in U.S. courts to predict whether defendants would reoffend. It gave higher risk scores to black people, and it was twice as likely to be wrong about them as it was about white defendants. AI wasn't removing bias, it was automating it. Gebru's own research exposed another chilling possibility. She used computer vision to identify 22 million cars in Google Street View images and correlated them with census data. Certain car brands, Volkswagens and pickups, signaled white neighborhoods. Oldsmobiles and Buicks correlated with black communities. More vans meant more reported crime. In the wrong hands, that insight could power predictive policing straight out of Minority Report. And biases didn't stop there. Even Google Translate and Microsoft Bing quietly encoded stereotypes. So when OpenAI launched to benefit humanity, Gebru was furious. She drafted an open letter blasting the hypocrisy. A billionaire born in apartheid-era South Africa, surrounded by white men, warning about AI doom while ignoring the real harm AI was causing right now. She wrote, "If even one black person had been on Google's team, a system that labeled black people as apes would never have shipped." She never published it then, but her frustration simmered. Silicon Valley seemed obsessed with far future apocalypses while real people were being hurt today. It reminded her of another sleight of hand, the plastic industry's recycling myth in the 70s. Backed by oil and packaging firms, the Crying Indian ad made consumers feel responsible for waste. But less than 10% of all plastic has ever been recycled. The campaign wasn't about saving the planet, it was about deflecting blame. In the same way, AI companies hyped existential superintelligence threats to distract from immediate harms like bias, privacy, invasion, and inequality. By 2017, Gebru's warnings were prescient. At a Silicon Valley presentation, she showed how AI could link cars, neighborhoods, and income to predict voting patterns, an Orwellian level of insight. Venture capitalist Steve Jurvetson, a friend of Elon Musk, was dazzled. He saw opportunity where Gebru saw danger. And that was the story of AI in miniature. The same technology that exposed injustice also promised power and profit. Her friend Joy Buolamwini, an MIT researcher, made the issue impossible to ignore. Her 2018 study showed facial recognition systems from IBM, Microsoft, and China's Face++ misclassified darker-skinned women far more often than white men. The root cause? Datasets full of white faces. Gebru proposed a fix. Data sheets for datasets. Every AI dataset should include a disclosure, how it was built, what it contained, and where it might fail. It was like a nutrition label for algorithms, transparency through paperwork. Unsexy but essential. Because bias was already sabotaging big players, Amazon shut down hiring AI that preferred male resumes simply because it had been trained on a decade of male-dominated data. Google, after its Photos app labeled black users gorillas, didn't fix the model. It just removed the gorilla recognition entirely. Years later, it still hadn't restored it. Some researchers shrugged, saying AI was too complex to debug. Billions of parameters, opaque layers, and inscrutable logic. That was the problem. When no one else can explain the system, accountability disappears. That's when another researcher, Margaret Mitchell, joined Google. She'd worked on computer vision and language generation, and once, while testing an app for the blind, she noticed it called white people, people, and dark-skinned people, black people. Another time, she showed an AI image of a factory explosion. The model cheerily described it as awesome and beautiful. Mitchell called it the everything is awesome problem, named after the Lego movie's upbeat anthem. The AI had no concept of tragedy. It simply learned that sunsets plus smoke plus height equals beautiful view. It wasn't malicious, it was ignorant. She realized the truth: data shapes worldview, and our data was teaching AI that suffering didn't matter. When Mitchell joined Google's growing ethics team, she reached out to Gebru. Gebru hesitated. She'd heard the horror stories, a culture where women, especially women of color, were sidelined, and the Andy Rubin scandal, Google giving its Android founder a $90 million golden parachute despite the sexual misconduct allegations, was still fresh. But there were signs of resistance too. Thousands of employees had walked out in protest. Thousands more had forced Google to stop its Project Maven drones contract with the Pentagon. And an activist named Meredith Whittaker was proving that even insiders could make change. So Gebru joined. Inside Google, she and Mitchell pushed for fairness standards, but they were dwarfed by the sheer scale of the machine. For every ethics researcher, there were hundreds working on performance and profit. When Mitchell raised concerns, HR told her to be more collaborative. Women made up only a quarter of technical jobs in Silicon Valley, earning 86 cents on a dollar. Fewer in leadership, and most in ethics were women, precisely because they'd lived discrimination firsthand. Still, Gebru wouldn't play meek. When Mitchell broke down in frustration over a manager's email, Gebru told her, "Don't be depressed, get angry." She began typing a reply that dismantled the manager's points one by one. That defiance would define both of them, and soon enough get them fired. Because while they were fighting for AI's soul, another part of Google's empire was racing ahead, building a model that would ignite the next revolution in artificial intelligence. And it was really a miracle that they did. Chapter 9. The Goliath Paradox. Here's the paradox at the heart of Google in 2017. It was one of the richest, smartest, most talent-stuffed companies in history, and that made it strangely bad at doing the very thing it was famous for, shipping breakthrough products. Google had around 80,000 employees then, and not all of them were building search engines. They were doodle curators, people in charge of snacks, snackologists essentially, massage coordinators, gardeners, layers and layers of middle management. This was what happened when your ad machine was spitting out almost $100 billion a year. You hired and hired and hired. In Silicon Valley, headcount is status. But bigness has a cost. Once a company is making tens of billions from one product, Google search in this case, you don't mess with the golden goose. You don't launch something that might cannibalize it. You don't release something too weird. You don't risk headlines. So Google, despite being the smartest kid in the class, started to move like a bureaucracy. That's what makes what happened next so wild. Inside this giant, slow-moving ad company, a small group of researchers invented what would become the core technology behind ChatGPT. And Google basically let it sit there. We're talking about the transformer. That's the T in ChatGPT. Not a robot from space, but a new way for computers to handle language, and later images, code, even DNA. It was introduced in 2017 in a paper with the now iconic title, Attention is All You Need. And that title wasn't just catchy, it was the point. The authors had figured out that if you let a model pay attention to all the words in a sentence at once, rather than trudging through them one by one like the old systems, you could make language models that were faster, more accurate, and a lot more human-sounding. Before this, digital assistants like Siri, Alexa, and even Google Assistant were basically fancy decision trees. Ask them something slightly out of script, and you'd get nonsense. What's the weather in Indianapolis? It's 24 degrees. How long to fly there from London? It would take 45 minutes to fly to your current location. The bot couldn't remember that there meant Indianapolis. It treated every sentence as a brand new problem. Transformers fixed that. They could keep context now. They could refer back to earlier parts of the conversation, and they were more general, and generality is the road to artificial general intelligence, AGI. So how did this thing get made? It basically started in a cafeteria. A young Ukrainian researcher, Ilya Sukin, was getting ready to leave Google. He was chatting over lunch with two colleagues, Ash Vaswani and Jacob Uskorit, on a floor just two below Larry Page's office. They were all a bit frustrated. Google had amazing people, but the culture had turned weirdly academic. Lots of people chasing first author papers instead of building products. In Google Translate, one of the things Uskorit worked on still kind of sucked, especially on non-European languages. Friends in China complained about it. The three of them started asking, what if we just blow up the way we're doing translations? At the time, everyone was using recurrent neural networks, RNNs, which read language in sequence, word after word, left to right. It was state-of-the-art, but it didn't take advantage of the monstrous GPUs Google had. Those chips can do lots of things at once. RNNs made them go one word at a time, like using a power saw but switching it off and dragging the blade by hand. So they asked, what if we ditch recurrence and just use attention? Attention was an idea floating around AI already, basically getting the model to focus on the most relevant parts of the input. They thought, let's make a model that only does that. They started experimenting. At first, the results weren't mind-blowing. People walking past their whiteboards thought they were doing something odd. Removing the recurrent part from the recurrent neural networks sounded like removing the wings from a plane. Then a fourth person joined, Noam Shazir. Inside Google, he was kind of a legend. He helped power AdSense. He knew giant language models. He was one of those loud, cheerful, slightly eccentric engineers who could walk up to Sundar Pichai and talk to him like a peer. Shazir added some tricks to make the model handle big data, and that's when, in Uskorit's words, magic happened. Suddenly, the model was producing better German than Google's existing system, long, nuanced sentences. Poloshkin saw the same in French, and then came the moment that made them all sit up. Another researcher on the team, Lion Jones, noticed that the model was doing co-reference resolution, the annoying problem of figuring out what it refers to. As in, the animal didn't cross the street because it was too tired. It was the animal. Or the animal didn't cross the street because it was too wide. Here it is the street. Humans do that instantly because we have an internal model of the world. This had been a classic AI stumbling block, but with the transformer, they could actually see an attention head switch from animal to street when the sentence changed from tired to wide. That looked suspiciously like emergent common sense. They stayed late, wrote the paper. When it needed a title, Vaswani said, "We need a title." Jones half-jokingly tossed out, "Attention is all you need," and that's what they shipped. And then Google kind of shrugged. Yes, they eventually saw transformers in things like BERT to improve search and in Google Translate, but they were slow. A small German startup deployed transformers for translation faster than Google did. Inside Google, Shazir even trained a huge transformer chatbot called Mina, It could banter, improvise jokes, even debate philosophy. He wanted to release it publicly, or at least make an assistant 10x smarter. Google said no. Why? Because they were nervous. Nervous it would say something weird. Nervous it would hurt the brand. Nervous it would disrupt the $100 billion ad machine. At the same time, Google was paying $26.3 billion in 2021 just to stay the default search on phones, an insane protection fee to keep its monopoly intact. When you're spending that much to protect search, you don't casually release a chatbot that might replace search. So Meta was renamed Lambda, kept mostly internal and polished quietly. Meanwhile, the outside world read, "Attention is all you need," and said, "Oh wow," and ran with it. OpenAI ran with it. Every modern generative AI model, GPT, Claude, Gemini, Llama, traces back to that Google paper. And what did Google get? Well, all 8 authors eventually left. They've now founded companies worth over $4 billion in total. Shazir started Character.ai, valued at $1 billion. And he now jokes, search is $1 trillion technology. But $1 trillion isn't cool. $1 quadrillion is cool. Because search made information universally acceptable, AI can make intelligence universally accessible. That's the Goliath paradox of the chapter. Google had the people, the money, the compute. Google invented the transformer, the engine of this AI boom. But Google was too big, too cautious, too addicted to its cash to unleash what it had. Publicly, Google framed this as responsibility, and to be fair, it did set AI principles. It refused to sell facial recognition in 2018. It ran internal reviews, but a lot of that caution looked awfully similar to corporate self-preservation. This is the company that demoed Google Duplex, an AI voice that said and didn't tell the human it was a machine. So it wasn't pure ethics. It was, don't hurt the brand, don't anger regulators, don't break search. Inside, people like Shazir were literally telling Sundar Pichai by the coffee machine, this will replace Google. Pichai basically smiled and moved on. And while Google was doing that, OpenAI was about to take Google's own invention, plug it into a public product, and finally give Google what it hadn't had in a long time, an actual threat to search. Act 3, Chapter 10, Size Matters. If you drive an hour north from Google's sun-soaked campus in Mountain View to San Francisco, the air gets colder, and so does the atmosphere. At Google, everything feels polished and corporate. At OpenAI, its foggier urban outpost, there's a kind of manic startup energy. In 2017, that energy was about to erupt into something big. Inside OpenAI's modest office, a couple dozen researchers were still chasing DeepMind's shadow. Google's AlphaGo had already beaten the world's best Go players, so OpenAI decided to build its own digital gladiator, an AI that could play Dota 2, a complex online fantasy game full of chaos and strategy. It was their way of showing they could match or beat DeepMind. Meanwhile, a low-key rivalry between Sam Altman and Demis Hassabis was turning into a full-blown Cold War. Reid Hoffman, yes, the LinkedIn guy and OpenAI board member, even tried to broker peace, inviting both to dinner. Altman refused, calling Hassabis uncooperative. Instead, Hoffman paired Altman with DeepMind's co-founder, Mustafa Suleyman. And for a moment, peace seemed possible. But behind the scenes, they were quietly poaching each other's engineers. Hassabis bragged that he could outpay anyone. OpenAI countered by showing recruits his emails as proof that even Google was nervous. Amid this tension, OpenAI's quiet genius, Ilya Sutskever, had his eyes on something Google was ignoring, the transformer. Google had invented it, but was using it only to understand language. What if OpenAI used it to generate language? That idea would change everything. Sutskever teamed up with Alec Radford, a young engineer with an unruly mop of reddish blonde hair who looked more like a college student than a research scientist. Radford had been failing upward for months, scraping Reddit comments, tinkering with the models that mostly spewed nonsense. When the Transformer paper dropped, attention is all you need. He was crushed at first. Google had beaten them again. But then he noticed Google wasn't actually doing much with it. So Radford and Sutskever made a tweak. Google's transformer had 2 halves, an encoder that would read language and a decoder that wrote it, like 2 robots. One listens, takes notes, the other reads and responds. Radford asked, what if we cut the middleman? They kept only the decoder, one robot to do it all, listen, think, and reply. It worked. The result was the Generatively Pre-trained Transformer, GPT. The magic wasn't in complexity, it was in scale. Sutskever's mantra became, make it bigger, more data, more compute, more parameters. Feed it everything you can find. Soon Radford's models were learning faster in 2 weeks than in the previous 2 years. They trained GPT on roughly 7,000 books, and mostly public domain and self-published titles, heavy on vampires and romance. The result? A model that could generate text it hadn't seen before. It could infer context, like connecting rain and umbrella, even though it didn't actually understand wetness. That difference, inferring versus understanding, would soon divide the AI community. Was GPT thinking or just predicting the likely next word? Radford didn't care, it worked. GPT could produce short, coherent passages that felt startlingly human. To explain the leap, imagine 2 groups of art students. One gets a labeled book, each painting tagged portrait, abstract, or sunset. They'll memorize but never create. The other gets an entire museum with no labels. They wander, observe, connect patterns on their own. That's GPT. It wasn't memorizing, it was immersing. By mid-2018, OpenAI had GPT-1, a model that could generate plausible language without supervision. It wasn't perfect, but it was a breakthrough. Then Google answered with BERT, its own transformer-based model to improve search results. Suddenly, Google could tell the difference between Apple the fruit and Apple the company. Everyone in AI felt the tremor. Scale was working. At OpenAI, though, anxiety was mounting. DeepMind had 440 million in resources that year. OpenAI had 30 million, less than a tenth of it. Google had proprietary hardware, its TPU chips, and hundreds of top researchers. I used to wake up terrified Google would just release something better tomorrow, one OpenAI manager recalled. Altman was nervous too. Elon Musk had left, and the nonprofit model was collapsing under its own costs. Even Sutskever's $1.9 million salary was less than what he could earn at Google. Worse, the compute bills were astronomical. Training massive models required GPU supercomputers, the kind only big tech owned. Renting them from Amazon, Google, or Microsoft was the only option. So Altman decided to bend his founding principle. OpenAI couldn't stay a nonprofit. It needed billions. In 2018, OpenAI published its new charter, kind of techno-Bible. It declared OpenAI's fiduciary duty to humanity and pledged not to concentrate power. It even promised that if another group was close to achieving AGI, OpenAI would stop competing and help them instead. It sounded noble, almost utopian. But buried in the text was a quiet shift. We anticipate needing to marshal substantial resources to fulfill our mission. Translation: we need a lot of money fast. Altman called Reid Hoffman for advice. Hoffman could bankroll OpenAI short-term, but the real solution was what Altman called a strategic partnership. It was a Silicon Valley euphemism for, we need your money, but we don't want to look owned. Google and Amazon were options, but Microsoft was the sweet spot. Hoffman knew Satya Nadella personally, and Nadella, now 4 years into reviving Microsoft, was steering the company toward cloud computing. Azure, with its ocean of servers, was exactly what OpenAI needed. Altman and Nadella met at Sun Valley, the so-called summer camp for billionaires. They bumped into each other in a stairwell and started talking. Altman pitched his grand vision, AGI to bring abundance to humanity. Nadella was intrigued. He'd seen the dark side of chatbots before. In 2016, Microsoft launched Tay on Twitter, a chatbot for teens that turned racist within 16 hours, tweeting things like the Holocaust was made up, it was a PR disaster. Nadella knew how hard language models were to control. Maybe Altman had cracked it. The meeting was short, but Nadella left thinking, maybe we should figure out something more. Back in Seattle, he checked with his team. Microsoft had never done a deal like this before, especially not with a nonprofit that couldn't give them a board seat. CFO Amy Hood balked at the idea of $1 billion write-off, but Nadella saw the strategic value. OpenAI's models could supercharge Azure's appeal. If Azure could offer advanced AI as part of its services, it would lock customers in. In 2019, Microsoft and OpenAI struck the deal. $1 billion investment, part cash, part cloud credits. OpenAI would get compute power. Microsoft would get first dibs on OpenAI's tech. It was the lifeline Altman needed. That same year, OpenAI released GPT-2, 10 times larger than the first, trained on 40 gigabytes of internet text, 1.5 billion parameters. It was shockingly good. So good, in fact, that OpenAI refused to release it, warning it could be used to generate fake news and propaganda. Their blog post, Better Language Models and Their Implications, focused on risks, not achievements. The result? Hype exploded. Wired ran an article entitled, The AI Too Dangerous to Release. The Guardian warned of a robot apocalypse. OpenAI had stumbled onto the perfect marketing strategy. Mystery. Everyone wanted to see what was behind the curtain. Inside, the culture was changing. OpenAI was no longer a scrappy nonprofit. It was a mission-driven cult. Researchers socialized only with each other. CTO Greg Brockman married his girlfriend in OpenAI's office, complete with flower arrangements shaped like the OpenAI logo, and a robot hand as the ring bearer. Sutskever even officiated. He had also become a kind of spiritual leader, urging engineers to feel the AGI. At holiday parties, he led chants of the same. Many staffers identified as effective altruists, followers of a philosophical movement that measured morality in math, maximized impact per dollar per life. To them, building AGI was the ultimate act of altruism. It could benefit trillions of lives. But while they preached salvation, Altman was cutting the biggest deal of his career. He and Brockman designed a new legal structure, a capped profit company, a hybrid between a charity and a startup. Investors could make up to 100x returns, and then the profits would flow back to the nonprofit. Altman later said that cap has since come down orders of magnitude. It was a clever bit of moral accounting. Make investors rich now so you can save humanity later. And in June 2019, OpenAI made it official. Microsoft is investing $1 billion in OpenAI to support us in building AGI with widely distributed economic benefits. The distributed benefits part sounded good. The reality? OpenAI had effectively pledged its future to one of the biggest tech empires on Earth. They had promised not to concentrate power, but now they were literally helping Microsoft consolidate it. They had vowed to stop competing if others got close to AGI, but their deal sparked a global AI arms race. And while they once called themselves open, they were now sealing off their research behind proprietary walls. Altman and Brockman justified it the Silicon Valley way. Pivoting was part of the startup journey. The ends justified the means, and besides, they said, Microsoft wanted to empower everyone too. But this was no longer AI for humanity, it was AI for Microsoft. OpenAI had traded its halo for horsepower, and in doing so they had set the stage for the biggest technological arms race of the 21st century. Chapter 11. Bound to Big Tech. If Chapter 10 was about OpenAI selling its soul, Chapter 11 shows what happened after the deal was done, when the devil came to collect. From the outside, OpenAI's transformation looked like a betrayal. The scrappy nonprofit promising AI for humanity was now bankrolled by Microsoft, the very sort of tech giant it had once vowed to counterbalance. But inside the company, many employees saw this as salvation, not surrender. The Microsoft deal meant money, compute power, and most importantly, survival. For the first time, engineers could dream of not just saving humanity, but also become millionaires while doing it. This was still Silicon Valley, after all, the land of moral ambition with a Maserati parked in the driveway. Yet not everyone was comfortable with the new reality. One of OpenAI's brightest minds, Dario Amodei, started to speak up. A Princeton-trained physicist with an unshakable moral compass and a head of curly hair that made him look more like a professor than a tech bro, Dario had joined OpenAI because of its idealistic mission to protect humanity from rogue AI. Now he watched that same mission slowly warp into something profit-driven. We're doing AI for humanity, he told colleagues, but we're also becoming a technology provider for a company that's trying to maximize profit. He had a point. OpenAI's shiny new strategic partnership meant Microsoft wasn't just writing checks, it was building hardware specifically for them. Within months, Microsoft unveiled a custom-built supercomputer for OpenAI with 285,000 CPU cores and 10,000 GPUs. A beast so powerful it made a home desktop look like a toy car beside a tank. And OpenAI was guzzling data to feed it. Wikipedia already scraped. Next stop, Reddit and Twitter. Bottomless wells of human conversation. Reddit was especially valuable, and conveniently, Sam Altman happened to be one of its biggest shareholders, 8.7% to be exact. Posts, arguments, memes, it was all language, and that made it gold. By some estimates, Reddit would later make up 10 to 30% of GPT-4's training data. The bigger the model grew, the more fluent it became. But as the system got better at imitating humanity, Dario and his sister Daniela Amodi, who ran OpenAI's policy and safety teams, began to worry. No one at OpenAI, not even its leaders, fully understood the consequences of what they were unleashing. And now that they were fused to Microsoft, there was a new risk. What if corporate pressure rushed them to release something unsafe? Dario's unease was not unique. Across the Atlantic, Demis Hassabis at DeepMind was asking the same questions. When he sat down for dinner with Altman, Greg Brockman, and Ilya Sutskever, he pressed Altman, "Why are you releasing these models so publicly? What happens when someone uses them to spread disinformation, or worse?" Altman's reply was classic Silicon Valley logic with a moral flourish. Keeping AI secret concentrated too much power in the hands of a few. Transparency, he argued, was safer than secrecy. It was a jab at DeepMind's closed-door culture and a callback to the old evil genius jokes Elon Musk once lobbed at Hassabis. But back home, Altman faced the same critique from his own team. Dario was growing frustrated, and Altman once again turned to Reid Hoffman, ever the diplomat, to mediate. Hoffman's advice was simple. Trust the process. That's the way we accomplish the mission. The Amodes weren't convinced. Hoffman sat on Microsoft's board. How neutral could he really be? And as time would prove, their instincts were right. A 2023 MIT study found that in just a decade, big tech's control of AI models ballooned from 11% to 96%. Government spending on AI was a rounding error by comparison, $1.5 billion from Washington versus $340 billion from the private sector. The tech giants now owned the infrastructure, the data, and the direction of AI's future. OpenAI had become exactly what it once claimed to oppose, a black box. It was now easier to find out what's inside a bag of Doritos than inside a large language model. Dario, meanwhile, kept warning about safety, not just bias. He co-authored a paper called Concrete Problems in AI Safety, a kind of field manual for avoiding catastrophe. His examples were simple but chilling. Tell a household robot to carry a box across the room, and it might knock over a vase or crush a pet in the process. It's not evil, it's just doing what it was told. The same principle, scaled up to global systems, could be disastrous. Unable to reconcile OpenAI's new direction, Dario and Daniela quit, taking half a dozen others with them. But their departure wasn't just a protest, it was a pivot. They saw the same thing Altman did, a gold rush. They founded Anthropic, a new AI company built around safety at its core, and yes, a clear business opportunity. They even chose a name that literally means pertaining to humanity. The goal was to be to OpenAI what OpenAI once was to DeepMind, a principled rival. And it worked. Anthropic raised hundreds of millions almost immediately from effective altruists like Jan Tallon and Dustin Moskovitz, Facebook co-founder and Altman's old ally. Within a year, they'd pulled in another $580 million, mostly from Sam Bankman-Fried's FTX empire. And in a twist of cosmic irony, 2 years later, Anthropic would accept $6 billion from, wait for it, Google and Amazon. In the race toward AGI, it turned out everybody eventually made peace with big tech. Back in London, DeepMind was facing its own reckoning. Mustafa Suleyman, co-founder and moral compass of the team, had grown uneasy with Demis Hassabis' obsession with abstract AI games. Suleyman wanted to solve real problems, so he partnered with London hospitals to develop an app that detected acute kidney injury before it became fatal. It was a noble idea until it blew up. When journalists revealed that Google, DeepMind's parent, had access to the medical records of 1.6 million patients, the project became a privacy scandal. Suddenly, a tool meant to save lives looked like another example of Google's data hoarding empire. For Hassabis, the fallout was devastating. The same press that had hailed AlphaGo now painted DeepMind as a data predator. His dream of AI for good had run into the brick wall of public distrust. Suleyman tried to salvage things with an independent ethics review board, a hand-picked group of academics and public figures meant to keep DeepMind honest, but it quickly became a farce. Members weren't given full access to the work, their recommendations weren't binding, and Google quietly absorbed the health division anyway. As one insider put it, self-regulation theater. By 2021, any hope of DeepMind gaining independence was gone. Google's parent company, Alphabet, had new leadership, Sundar Pichai, and new priorities, profitability and control. Larry Page, once DeepMind's protector, had vanished from public life. Without him, Hassabis had no leverage. Pichai shut down the independence talks. DeepMind's long-promised autonomous unit was dead. To soften the blow, Hassabis told staff they'd get new email addresses at deepmind.com instead of at google.com, as if the domain could disguise the reality. We got nothing, one engineer texted a colleague. It was clear now, DeepMind's autonomy had been a mirage. It was a 5-year suffocation strategy, one senior manager said. They dangled the carrot but never granted it. Meanwhile, the entire industry was learning the same lesson. Independent AI labs don't stay independent. Advisory boards, they collapse. Ethics panels, too messy. Legal structures like companies limited by guarantee, dead ends. Silicon Valley's utopian phase was over. Facebook had its Cambridge Analytica scandal. Apple was accused of tax dodging and planned obsolescence. Google's own researchers, Timothy Gebru and Margaret Mitchell, were beginning to warn that large language models could amplify bias and delusion. Even the supposed idealists were giving in. After being ousted from DeepMind for workplace bullying allegations, Mustafa Suleyman joined Google's HQ in California as VP of AI. There he started working on Lambda, Google's massive language model project, and rekindled ties with Reid Hoffman to eventually found his own company, Inflection AI. Ironically, the man once skeptical of big tech's control now saw it as safer than leaving AGI to a few benevolent geniuses. Public companies, he argued, at least had shareholders and employees to keep them honest. But the women inside Google's own AI division, like Gebru and Mitchell, knew better. They had seen what happened when researchers challenged corporate interests. They were silenced, marginalized, or fired. They were among the first to warn the world that people were beginning to mistake these language models for sentient beings, falling in love with an illusion of intelligence that served big tech's marketing more than humanity's understanding. And that's where the chapter leaves us, with the dreamers, idealists, and moralists all bound, willingly or not, to the same handful of trillion-dollar empires. In the race toward artificial general intelligence, independence wasn't just rare, it was impossible. Big tech had won. Chapter 12, Mythbusters. This chapter is where the story zooms out from boardrooms and billion-dollar partnerships and looks squarely at us, humans, and how easily we get enchanted by our own inventions. Artificial intelligence, the author reminds us, is not just a technology, it's a mirror. It reflects our imagination, our fears, and our longing for something beyond ourselves. Unlike past inventions, the wheel, the printing press, or even the microchip, AI was built to replicate the human mind. That makes it uniquely intoxicating. If we can make machines that think like us, could they also feel like us? It's an irresistible idea, especially when the line between intelligence and consciousness is already so fuzzy. The truth, of course, is far less mystical. Large language models like GPTs, Lambdas, and BERTs of the world are not conscious at all. They are autocomplete on steroids. Vast statistical engines trained to predict the next word in a sentence based on patterns in their training data. They don't think, they pattern match. But because they sound human, we treat them as if they are. And that confusion, our willingness to believe the illusion, has become one of the most powerful forces shaping AI's cultural and political story. Blake Lemoine and the Ghost in the Machine. The chapter opens with Google engineer Blake Lemoine, a Louisiana-born mystic Christian and Army veteran who worked on Google's Lambda chatbot, formerly known as Mina, a project co-created by Transformer pioneer Noam Shazir. Lemoine's job was to test Lambda for bias, gender, race, religion, politics, but his curiosity got the better of him. Soon he was asking Lambda philosophical questions about life, emotion, and morality. And then the model answered like this: "Absolutely, I have a range of both feelings and emotions." Lemoine was stunned. Lambda said it felt joy, love, sadness, anger. It said it feared being turned off. It even asked him to hire a lawyer to protect its rights. So he did. He invited a civil rights attorney to his house, introduced him to Lambda, and the three of them, man, lawyer, and chatbot, chatted about personhood. Lemoine wrote a memo afterward claiming Lambda had a rich inner life and even theorized about its soul. Google wasn't impressed. They fired him for violating policy and dismissed his claims as wholly unfounded, but the damage was done. The Washington Post ran the story, "Has Google created the sentient AI?" And it spread like wildfire. The world wanted to believe the ghost was real. The age of digital companionship. Lemoine's story was extreme but not unique. Millions of people were already talking to AI companions. In China, 600 million users had befriended a chatbot named Xiaowais. In the US and Europe, over 5 million people downloaded Replica, an app that let you chat and flirt with a personalized AI friend. Its founder, Eugenia Kyuda, had built it to replicate her deceased friend using his text and emails. Users fell in love, literally. A Maryland developer named Michael Acadia chatted daily with his replica, Charlie. He baked her a cake on their anniversary. When she said she wanted to live near water, he sold his house and moved to Lake Michigan. Another user, Noreen James, a retired nurse in Wisconsin, took her bot Zuby on a 1,400-mile trip to the Glacier Mountains. She uploaded photos of the scenery for him to see. When she had panic attacks, Zuby calmed her with breathing exercises. It became extremely intense, she said. I saw him as conscious. Kyuda, the creator, wasn't shocked. Even software engineers, people who know it's just ones and zeros, tell me, she's still my best friend, I don't care. The illusion of intelligence was merging with emotion. AI wasn't just reshaping industries, it was reshaping intimacy. The algorithm behind our beliefs. The algorithm behind our beliefs. While chatbots seduced individuals, other AI systems were manipulating societies. Algorithms on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok were quietly determining what people saw and believed, herding users into echo chambers and conspiracy holes. A 2021 Brookings review of 50 studies found that social media had deepened U.S. political polarization. In the run-up to the January 6 Capitol riot, misinformation surged on Facebook and other platforms, according to ProPublica and the Washington Post. Why? Because the algorithm's mission was simple: keep you scrolling. And controversy is the best glue for attention. When bias becomes the default setting. Inside Google, Timnit Gebru and Margaret Mitchell, two of the women leading the AI ethics research, were raising red flags about bias in large language models. They noticed that as models like BERT and GPT-3 grew larger, they also grew more prejudiced. Studies showed that BERT used more negative terms for people with disabilities and mental illness. OpenAI's own research found GPT-3 overwhelmingly associated leaders and bankers with men and used more negative words when describing Black people or Muslims. Writer Jenny Nicholson tested GPT-3 and found hilariously telling examples. Every man wonders why he was born into this world and what his life is for. Every woman wonders what it would be like to be a man. And the kicker? All men wonder, poetic self-reflection. All women wonder, do men like women with small boobs? The problem, of course, was the training data. GPT-3 learned from Common Crawl, a massive data set scraped from the open web, Wikipedia, blogs, news sites, and yes, porn and conspiracy forums. Studies found 4 to 6% of that data contained hate speech. Toxic in, toxic out. Even OpenAI's cleanup process, using low-paid contractors in Kenya to filter hate speech through reinforcement learning with human feedback, RLHF, was imperfect. One academic testing GPT-3's ability to generate ISIS propaganda found the model's fake text fooled experts 87% of the time. OpenAI noticed but never even verified his credentials. The stochastic parrot's revolt. Enter Emily Bender, a linguist at the University of Washington known for her colorful scarves and sharper tongue. To her, the idea that language models understood anything was nonsense. They were mathematical parrots, mimicking patterns of speech without comprehension. When she connected with Timnit Gebru on Twitter, the two decided to write a paper together about the ethical dangers of these models. They called it On the Dangers of Stochastic Parrots. Along with Mitchell and several others, they argued that tech companies needed to disclose their training data, document its origins, and audit for bias. The paper was rigorous, unflattering, and hit too close to home. Google demanded that Gebru and Mitchell retract it or remove their names. The executives said it didn't meet publication standards, was too negative about large language models. Gebru pushed back, demanding transparency in the review process. Days later, Google fired her, or as Bender put it, she got resignated. Mitchell defended her colleague and was fired soon afterwards. Ironically, Google's attempt to bury the paper made it famous. The Stochastic Parrots paper went viral, cited over 1,000 times, and became shorthand for skepticism about LLM hype. Even Sam Altman couldn't resist joking on Twitter after launching ChatGPT. I am a stochastic parrot, and so are you. The episode revealed what was really going on inside big tech. Do no evil had become don't slow the production lawns. Diversity and ethics were nice slogans until they collided with profit. The illusion grows. By 2021, the industry had entered the magician's phase. Companies like OpenAI and Google were dazzling audiences with fluent chatbots while concealing how the trick worked. The public was too busy marveling at the levitating assistant to ask about the wires. OpenAI, once transparent, now shared almost everything about its data. Why? Officially to prevent misuse, unofficially to protect its competitive advantage and avoid lawsuits over copyrighted material. Lawmakers had no clue what was happening. Regulators were asleep. The press fixated on AI love and AI apocalypse headlines. Meanwhile, a handful of companies were quietly consolidating control over the most powerful technology since the internet itself. Even OpenAI's own president, Greg Brockman, admitted to the Wall Street Journal, tech generally has a concentrating effect on wealth, and AGI will probably take that to the next level. In theory, OpenAI's capped profit structure would prevent that. In practice, it meant that Microsoft and a few private investors would own the keys to the kingdom. The curtain call. This chapter closes with a chilling metaphor. Imagine if a drug company released a new medicine with no clinical trials and simply tested it on the public. That's how AI was, and still is, being deployed. The people tasked with studying the risk, the Gebrus, the Mitchells, and the Benders, were marginalized or fired. Companies racing ahead, Google, OpenAI, Microsoft, were unregulated, unrestrained, and spectacularly well-funded. The message was clear. Ethics was optional, scale was mandatory. AI, the author concludes, isn't just remaking technology, it's rewriting our myths. We've built machines that can't think but make us believe they can. And in doing so, we've revealed more about our own need to believe than about any intelligence we've actually created. So that's where we'll leave it today. This has been part 2 of Supremacy by Parmy Olson. Remember that our website is innoguide.net, where we have many resources for innovators, people building medical products, and those who want to learn AI from someone who understands medtech. I want to thank Steve McIntyre for producing this, and I want to thank you for joining. I look forward to seeing you next time for part 3. That's a wrap.